Okay, so sorry about that. I had a bit of a work phone call come through, so I couldn't not pick that up. Okay, so just to get back to it. This is where you'll notice that Mr. Burling then becomes very, very foolish looking to the audience, because remember, this is meant to be set in 1912, but actually it's performed in 1946. So that was after World War One, after World War Two, after the Titanic sank, after we realised that actually the way we were doing things wasn't working. So Mr. Burling says, you can ignore all this silly pessimistic talk. When you marry, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Yes, a very good time. And soon it will be an even better time. That's where we get the dramatic irony from. It will be an even better time. That doesn't really make sense to us, because we actually start to realise that actually they're not marrying at a good time, going into an even better time. They're actually marrying at one of the worst times in British history. And Mr. Burling sort of dismisses that. He says, last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible trouble, labour trouble in the near future. Don't worry. We've passed the worst of it. We employers are at last coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected, and we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity. To prosper means to do very well, and we know that businesses didn't do very well during World War One, because the problem was that the businesses didn't have customers. You know, everyone was at war, everyone was poor, everyone was trying to make do, mend. They weren't buying new things, and the government was really sending out all the money they had to the war effort. So it's not a steadily increase, it's not a time of increasing prosperity. And that's where the dramatic irony starts to make Mr. Burling look very foolish. Pausing, make a note. And Eric then says, what about war? Now, this is the first time that we start to see Eric as actually quite switched on, quite aware. Make a note. Mr. Burling then says, glad you mentioned it, Eric, I'm coming to that. Just because the Kaiser makes a speech or two, or a few German officers have too much to drink and begin talking nonsense, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable, and to that I say fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war, nobody wants war except some half-civilised folks in the Balkans. And why? There's too much at stake these days, everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. Now, this is where the irony is again coming through. Mr. Burling is saying that we should not be worried about war. And the dramatic irony is that obviously the audience knows we should be worried about war, because war is going to happen. And that's the issue here. Mr. Burling is a foolish man, and he's being presented as a foolish man. So he then says everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. That's really interesting as well, because Mr. Burling belongs to the upper classes. Now, the upper classes had a lot to lose, and it's quite tragic, really, because the lower classes had even more to lose, because the upper classes lost their businesses and a lot of money, but the lower classes lost their lives. That's who was sent out to war. It was the privates who died mostly, and those were lower class sort of farm workers and labourers and men. Eric then says, yes, I know, but still, just let me finish, Eric. You've got a lot to learn. And I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business. Now, notice the repetition. Note it down. Pause if you need to. Notice the repetition there. I'm a practical man of business. Look at that adjective. Zoom in on that adjective. To call someone practical, you are saying that they are a logical person, that they really, really pay attention to what's going on. Now, the fact that he then says, I am a logical man of business, a practical man of business, that means I'm logical. That means I think things through. And actually, as an audience, we know that he's not thinking through anything he's saying, because all these things come true. Now, move on in the speech, and he starts talking about the Titanic. Unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable. Looking at those adjectives again, those repeated adjectives, unsinkable. Mr. Burling's very, very sure of himself, but he is proven wrong. And the whole point of this is that if Mr. Burling is proven wrong here, it's almost calling into question if Mr. Burling is wrong for the rest of the play. So every time Mr. Burling mentions something later on in the play, we start to think, actually, is Mr. Burling just wrong all the time? Because he's wrong here, so what's stopping him from being wrong the rest of the time, really? So he talks about a few German officers talking nonsense. Look at that adjective, nonsense. He's throwing it away. He's pushing it to the back of his mind. He's saying this isn't going to happen. A few German officers talking nonsense. And a few scaremongers here making a fuss about nothing. And you remember, and you three young people, just listen to this and remember what I'm telling you now. In 20 or 30 years, let's say, in 1940, you may be giving a little party like this. Your son or daughter might be getting engaged. And I tell you, by that time, you'll be living in a world that will have forgotten about these capital versus labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. There'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere. That's interesting again, because we know the dates of World War II, 1940 to 1945. It actually started in 1939. But 1940 was where there was a lot of fighting going on. So the idea that they would be sat there with their sons or daughters or anything like that is quite sad. Now, Gerald and Eric might not even make it to that point in time. They might die in World War I. They might. That's what happens. Young men go to war, they die. And if they do make it, actually, there won't be weddings. Most of the men would have been called up to go to World War II. So again, there's an issue here. Mr. Burling is wrong again. He has safely cemented himself as a really foolish character to the audience. Make a note, pause if you need to. And he talks about not really listening to people, because he once again calls himself, near the end of the page, guess what? A hard-headed, practical man of business. Once again, he calls himself that. So again, he's repeated this 3 times now. And he's started to add in that word practical, meaning that he thinks that he really knows best. And that's where the dramatic irony comes in. And that's where we start to see Mr. Burling as incorrect as a character. And this is linking to Priestley's message that capitalists at the time were very, very ignorant, and they were hurting others by pretending to or ignoring the actual issues that were going on in society at the time, because they were so focused on themselves. And that's where you have the problems here. That's where you have the issues coming through. Priestley is angry, and Priestley is using Mr. Burling as a tool to voice that anger. Write that down. Pause it if you need to. And he talks about then Mrs. Burling leaves, and so does Sheila. And he talks later on page 8. I'm just here. If you need to pause it and find where I am, please do that now. He actually talks about, there's something he wants to mention to Gerald, and he says that it's in strictest confidence whilst they're by themselves. I have an idea that your mother, Lady Croft, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels like you might have done better for yourself socially, meaning you might have got a more sort of a richer girl, a more upper class girl. No, Gerald, that's all right. Don't blame her. She comes from an old country family, landed people and so forth. So it's only natural. But what I wanted to say, there's a fair chance that I might find my way into the next honours list. Just a knighthood, of course. So look at how Mr. Burling is dropping his status in. Oh, no, I am going to get more status. So again, he's starting to think less about the love between Sheila and Gerald that they're sort of trying to focus on, and he starts to think more about the way they are viewed as a couple, and whether Mr. Burling is really rich enough to sort of make this union between them happen. And Mr. Burling says it's a bit too early for the congratulations. You see, I was Lord Mayor here 2 years ago when the royalty visited us. So Mr. Burling is a political man. He's Lord Mayor. He was Lord Mayor. So again, he's a political man, and you can see where this will come to hand a little bit later on, when he starts talking. Now, Mr. Burling, as a politician, is meant to care about others, meant to take these things seriously. And he's not so far. So in the next video that you guys will be watching, we'll actually be talking a little bit more about Mr. Burling and the way he reacts to actually being a public person, to being a politician. Politicians have to care about people. They have to do the work for the people. Does Mr. Burling do that? Does he believe that he should be working to improve the lives of others? Or is Mr. Burling only out for himself? So that's something we'll start to think about. But at this moment in time, I want you to go back over everything we've read. I want you to have a look at the strained relationships and make sure you've made notes on all of those strained relationships. Okay, thank you.